Ladies and gentlemen, I said it in the video before, gonna say it again, the EFF is in perpetual decline. But before we get on to the main news story, let's look at some other news stories that you might have missed. The first is Tito is getting a state funeral, because according to the ANC, he deserves it. Yep, that's the reason, he deserves it. In other news, the ANC's former MP and spokesperson, yep, a spokesperson, that's a person that addressed the media about all things related to the ANC. Well, he's in court for specialist commercial crimes for corruption. This is after a forensic report which suggests that during a tender allocation in October 2016, corruption was committed. Yeah, that's never happened before in the ANC. I mean, how many times have we heard of these stories of tender corruption? Now, you see, why this story is relevant is because Ramakopa now says that the Powerships deal is dead. He says that now that Eskom is stabilized, we don't need the ships. Now, for those of you who don't recall, the Powerships was originally going to be a 20-year deal. And lots of people asked why it was so long, and the actual cost of it was set to be 218 billion all over the period. But don't worry, it would alleviate one stage of load shedding, which now turns out we didn't need because we don't have load shedding, because somehow we've finally fixed the energy grid. Now you see, this becomes interesting because the Powerships deal has been in dispute for a long time. And the reasons for its dispute were numerous. First were disputes around greenhouse gases and what it would do to the South African green agenda. The second one was around the transparencies of the bids. The third was around the financial viability of the project. Now, for those of you who had been monitoring the Powerships deal, the greenhouse gases was taken to court and they had to prove that it wouldn't be, environmentally damaging. And then they bought like some game farm for the government, and that was apparently going to offset the environmental damage. Then the transparency of the process was an issue, with lots of people saying that this was nothing more than Gwede Matashe's attempt to solicit a bribe from the Turkish company, the Powerships company. And a lot of people said that the only real reason that the deal was favoured in the first place was, well, because of the potential lucre that it could have meant for the ANC ministers and, ANC representatives. Obviously, that was all hyperbole and nobody could actually prove that. But, the allegations were, I suppose, to a degree sound. Because, you see, it now turns out that we actually just don't need the ships, you see. And, you see, the Powerships company was asked to finalise their financial bids by the end of 2023, and they failed to do so, which meant that their actual bid has now expired, and the actual deal that they potentially had with Eskom just completely falls away. No biggie. And with that, the whole saga comes to a close. But there's so many questions that you can raise to this. I mean, I recall a time when Gwede Matashe was saying it was vitally important. We would never solve load shedding without the Powerships. EFF even shouted that. I mean, they big thing was if they came to power in the last elections, they were going to have Powerships everywhere, and now we don't need them. Look, one has to ask the questions why. Why is it suddenly all hunky-dory with a new minister there and other ministers not there, and now the deals that we did need, we don't need? And I go back to the last story around, tender corruption, but what am I to say? I mean, you've got the information, you do with it what you will. But actually onto the main news story, and that is the former public prosecutor, Bucisiwe Rezaan, as MP from the EFF. Now, for those of you who don't know, she was the first public prosecutor to be sacked from Parliament. This was after a really lengthy parliamentary process into an investigation into whether or not she was incompetent. And eventually it led to voting in Parliament, and everybody said, yep, she was pretty incompetent. She attempted the Stalingrad. She had Dalian Mpofu, representing her at points. At some point he was charging millions for it, and then claimed that those were peanuts. Then she said she couldn't pay for representation, and she just stalled the process forever and a day. And at the end of it, she was obviously voted out of her position. She got fired, and then she joined the EFF, as a protest vote, I suppose. Because that's what the EFF does. Everybody else rejects them, the EFF takes them. Well, now it turns out that she's resigning from the EFF. Now, she actually revealed this on a podcast. Dalian Mpofu's son's podcast, which he has on SABC for reasons. Now, interestingly enough, an SABC report had previously suggested that she would be the next EFF fighter to leave, and to that she responded and said, I will never betray the fighters. They are my political home. And then she did betray them, because she's leaving. And she announced it on X and on a podcast. Yeah, she didn't really give Julius much time to consider that, did she? But in her resignation letter, she basically says, after careful consideration of her current life and her family, she needs to go spend some time with her family. and fight for the vulnerable elsewhere. Whilst wearing Gucci clothing, she still maintains that her removal from public prosecutor was unconstitutional and she's a perpetual forever and a day victim. Or as Eric Draven once said, victims, aren't we all? According to her, the media targeted her, judges targeted her, Parliament targeted her, everyone targeted her. And it never crossed her mind to ever ask the question, if everybody seems like they're against me, maybe I'm the problem? And to the rest of us, that seems pretty obvious, because you see, when she was originally dismissed, she then appealed her dismissal, and it eventually went to the Supreme Court, and that judge dismissed her appeal, and then she racially attacked him. And recently, she tried to go through the whole process again. It's gone to a high court judge, and he's like, we're a lower court, we can't overrule what a higher court says. There's zero prospects of this succeeding, so your application to appeal is denied. And then she racially abused him. So she racially abused two judges, but it's the judges' faults, right? Now, she did go on and apologize for her outburst in Parliament, but Parliament says they're investigating anyway, because, it's unparliamentary conduct of a MP. Now, she maintains the only reason anybody's against her is because she wanted to fight against CR17 and Pala Pala. So it's all politically motivated. But she seems to forget that in loads of instances she went before judges, and judges in their judgments would say that she was basically incompetent. She just never won cases. And quite frequently they would impose personal cost orders against her for failing to follow judicial process, because according to them, she was incompetent. But now the Parliament says they're going to investigate all of her racially charged statements. She now says that, Parliament's a terrible place, and she just couldn't possibly want to be there. She does actually let the cat out the bag and does go on to say that it's a terrible place because the EFF doesn't have the numbers and aren't important enough to just basically tell everybody else to voetsak. And this betrays a big problem with such individuals, which we keep seeing. Whilst the ANC had a majority and could force through anything they wanted, let us not forget she was appointed by Zuma when the ANC had an overwhelming majority, and the ANC could just force through whatever bulldust they wanted and could say whatever they wanted without any repercussions, without any investigations. These guys were kings of the hill, and they just felt that they were like untouchable. But the minute that majority is lost, all of a sudden they're the perpetual victim for basically not following the rules. Because that's what they constantly do. They don't follow the rules. And talking of don't follow the rules, let's actually look who her husband is. So her husband is actually an MP for the MK party, who also don't follow the rules. And very interestingly enough, she has now been suggested that the MK party now may attempt to persuade her to join the MK party. Very interesting development, which is completely predictable in its entirety, because it would appear that a number of the EFF individuals are now migrating to the MK party, specifically because the EFF party appears to be in perpetual decline, which I did a video on. And many EFF bots jumped in the comment section to say I was full of rubbish and I must be a racist for thinking that. But the numbers don't lie, and the individuals are fleeing that party in rapid succession, which leaves so many unanswered questions, such as the ANC at the moment appears to be siding with the EFF in some swing municipalities and metros in order to use their numbers in order to bolster up the vote. But what will they do long term, specifically with the EFF in that decline? This doesn't seem to be a long-term strategy, does it? And clearly the EFF must think somehow that they're going to be able to reverse this fortunes. But with the decline and the departure of senior individuals, this doesn't look likely. It does look like, from the outside, that the EFF will eventually collapse. And possibly Julius may attempt to go home back to the ANC, underneath the ticket of unifying the left and the ANC and, arresting electoral defeat and bringing it back above 50% of the vote. I don't know. You can imagine the story they'll paint. But in any case, this all becomes very interesting because a number of these individuals appear to be fleeing to MK. But you see, MK has recently changed its constitution to mean that Jacob Zuma holds constitutional supremacy in that party, constitutional being their own internal constitution. What that effectively means is that king of that party, he basically has iron rule to do what he says. He's even been on record as saying, why do we need voting in this party? Like, voting has achieved nothing for our people. We should just listen to me. I'll tell you what to do. But this raises a question as to what happens when Jacob Zuma goes, because no one lives forever, including me, and unfortunately, he's not that young anymore, is he? So one asks the question, if you cement all the power in you, and then ultimately you pass, what happens to that power? and usually it implodes. It results in a form of civil war. And that civil war is likely to engulf the MK party, which will ultimately, and I can predict, as many analysts are, that it will lead to their eventual decline. But that's just my views. You can let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.